What is truth, and how do we find truth in a world of deception? Are there biblical truths about our world and our lives that we can trust? And who are the key players in the end times? What does the Bible say about the Middle East, Iran, China, and Russia? And is there proof for what Scripture says? What do recent archaeological exploration tell us about the Bible? Who were the Anunnaki? What are angels, demons, and the Nephilims? Will the Nephilims return? Are there interdimensional beings, and how do they relate to the Bible? Stick around as we dive into Scripture for more answers in this episode of Mission Truth.
Welcome again, everybody, to an undisclosed location in the backwoods of somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, where we are coming to you with another Conversation of Truth episode here on Mission Truth. As usual, I am Trevor, and this is Nick here, your host for the great conversation that we're having today. If you have seen one of our recent episodes, we did it on a basically the flood and the theories that we have concerning the flood. Now, really, there's only just two theories that we discuss. I briefly discussed the Canopy theory, and the one that that Nick introduced me to is the Hydroplate theory. I've been looking into that and realizing it's a very, very solid theory. And we just thought it would be a good idea to expound with another episode on the Hydroplate theory, because there's so much information with it as far as it explaining how things happened in the flood. And that's one of the things, especially for me, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, you want to try to find an explanation of how things happen when you read about it in the Bible, or not even in the Bible, but you have this flood story across the world, and how it exactly happened and what the physics were behind it, and how it affected the earth. And this theory is very solid in my opinion. So
at least on the outset. It's like I said, it's been heavily investigated by the guy who developed the theory and a few other people, but it's yet to go under, any sort of real scientific scrutiny, because people have pretty much just sort of ignored it. Because number one, it's creation science. So
that's what I think is fascinating about it. It's not just creation science. It uses like the physical world science. It's nothing that's made up, I guess. I mean, it basically uses Genesis chapter 7, verse 11 and basic physics to sort of give a pretty good case for how the world got the way that it is and why the flood looked like the way that it is. So we did do, I think it was the last episode, we did a mechanism, or I sort of went through a very quick step-by-step process of what the Hydroplate theory says happened on the earth. This episode's really going to be about expounding on a few of those things and talking a little bit more in depth about maybe some of the things we talked about in the first episode, which was more geared toward evidences for a flood. And we're going to basically connect the two and show how, very briefly, how the theory connects to those evidences. And we may throw in one or two other. Before I get started, I do want, this is going to be just an overview. It's not going to go in depth into the science. The science is there. You can go to hydroplate.org. You can also go to YouTube and look up a creator called Brian Nickel. You can just type in Hydroplate theory. You'll see it there. They have some really good resources for a more in-depth scientific discussion of the material there. So this is just a primer. This is just going to kind of whet your appetite. And so I'm going to kind of get started with just some discussion on the basis of the Hydroplate theory, which is sort of a rehash of what we did last episode. And I also want to talk very briefly about some of the problems with plate tectonics. So the idea of the Hydroplate theory comes from basically from Genesis 7:11. Can you read that for us real quick? I'm going to read that real quick. We're just going to say here in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened.
So what's the
the focus of that.
It gives a specific day and
Right.
time. But the interesting thing is that the floodgates of the deep,
Yeah, the fountains of the
fountains
deep.
of the deep. Yeah, it says the fountains of the great deep and the floodgates
Yeah.
of the heavens.
And there's a
were
reference to those fountains in one of the Psalms as well.
Yes.
And I don't know the reference to it right now. But basically, Walt Brown, who was the guy who came up with this theory, looked at that verse and said, okay, the Bible seems to suggest that there was water beneath the earth, and a lot of water beneath the earth if they were going to burst open. And so he started to kind of develop what that would look like and what some of the physical consequences of that kind of thing would be. And he developed the hydroplate theory, which basically says that the earth's crust was built or sat upon a layer of mostly water, maybe some crystalline structure that the water was inside of. Maybe the crust at certain points would sink down and touch the mantle to give it some support. But the idea is that as the moon revolved around the earth, and of course the earth revolved around the sun, the gravitational pull of those two bodies would cause sort of a pumping action where the crust would stretch and contract each day as the gravitational pull, just kind of like how you could take a balloon and stretch it and what that would actually do is, in some respects, it would create sort of this thermal energy from the friction and the work that's being done and could actually heat the ground and provide somewhat of a steady temperature to the ground. That's kind of outside what we want to talk about. But the idea is that at some point, we'll call it a skin, the Earth's skin ruptured. And when it did, it ripped like a balloon. And if we can pull up that first graphic we have, you'll see what's called the mid-oceanic ridge. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But basically, this is the leftover of the seam, and we'll talk about how it came to be. But the pattern by which the surface of the Earth ripped open, and the water would come out from the crack and essentially be supersonically jettisoned up into the air, and be taking rock and sediment with it along the way and throwing it up into the air. And then what would happen is over time, as that ridge begins to bulge out, the continents, still lubricated by water, would slide away from one another. And this is where we get sort of the continental drift that science seems to think has happened over time. And then at some point, those plates lost the water or most of the water that was underneath them, and frictional forces then begin to slow the plates. The plates buckled, causing mountain ranges, causing some other things that we'll talk about. And so now the current state of the Earth is that these hydroplates are actually in contact with the mantle now. There's not water, no significant water at least, up underneath them. And as they begin to settle or jostle against one another, that's where we get earthquakes and the magma that causes volcanoes and that kind of stuff coming to the surface.
So what you're basically stating here is that, and you said one of the things you want to point out is the plate tectonics, where they're saying that instead of where our current our current science says there's one plate going under another, you're thinking that it's floating on the mantle.
Well, yeah. So basics of plate tectonics would say that there's actually that the Earth's crust actually circulates. In other words, it goes out and goes down into the mantle and recirculates back. So the mid-oceanic ridge is actually a place where new crust is being formed. So it's coming up from the mantle and being spread out. They call it seafloor spreading. And then on the other side, around the Ring of Fire and along these, what they would consider tectonic plates,
just explain the Ring of Fire, because there might be some people.
Oh, the Ring of Fire is the ring around basically the Pacific Ocean, where most of the volcanic activity, 75% of volcanic activity, and a large portion of the major earthquakes happen. And so what they think in these fault lines, especially these big ones, is that tectonic plates are being shoved up underneath, cycling back in one of them is cycling back into the earth while the other one is sliding over the top of it. Now, this presents some problems because when you have two very flat edges, it might be possible, even though the thickness of the plates, I think, would seem to say no. It's maybe very easy for one to subduct up underneath it and underneath the other one. The problem is none of these fault lines are straight.
Right.
So when you have curved surfaces, it's hard to even like visualize how that would even happen.
Yeah.
Because you would have crumpling that would need to happen. Brian Nickel, in one of his videos, shows this very nice with a bed sheet and a circular table, how the crease lines and stuff. Hydroplate theory has been around for a while, and it's been taken pretty much as science on faith, in my opinion.
Right.
And that's not just my opinion. You will find other scientists that have similar opinion. There's just a lot of problems with the plate tectonic theory, but from an old Earth perspective, that's all you got. That's really all you really got. So that's been and they've used, I think, that as sort of a gatekeeper to keep other theories out. As if you don't assent to modern plate tectonic theory, it's sort of like evolutionary theory. They just discount it right out.
Just to clarify, he's meaning the tectonic. He said hydroplate theory, but you meant tectonic plate theory is taken in faith.
Oh,
not
the
hydroplate theory.
plate tectonic.
Yeah, the
sorry,
plate
I may have
tectonic.
misspoke.
Want to make sure that we clarify that.
Plate tectonic.
The hydroplate is a theory. The plate tectonics is some people are saying is settled science, which I don't agree with at all. And that's what Nick is pointing out there as far as our tectonic plates go. So now that it's created all of these rifts, what continued from that point on?
Well, the first thing I want to talk about in depth is the oceanic ridges. And I said this a minute ago that plate tectonic theory says that it's caused by seafloor spreading. And there's a couple of problems with that beyond just the physics of plate tectonics itself. When you look at the mid-oceanic ridge, we talked about this in the other episode, it's not a compression crack.
Right.
It's a
rip.
It's a tension crack.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that it is a mountain range. So it is pushed up, but it is also at the same time pulled apart in two directions. So if you imagine the seam of a baseball, it has rips along the main seam that goes around, and then it has intermittent rips that are perpendicular to the main rip. And you can see a little bit of the hatching on it here. You have to get into some closer up views to actually see it. And they know these. They've done several experiments to know these rifts exist in that configuration. But what the hydroplate theory says happened is there was actually overlaying rock on top of that ridge, so to speak, which wasn't a ridge at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And when the fountains broke up, all of that rock that was on top of those ridges were all of a sudden removed. So you had millions and millions of tons of rock that was pressing down on the mantle. And when that rock was suddenly removed, well, physics says that force has to be equalized.
Yeah.
And so what happened is the mantle actually bucked up in the sections where the rock was removed. And because it's a solid, it has no choice but to fracture in a tension fracture.
Yeah.
And so you have this main fracture that happens, the seam that you see here, that's happening at several hundred miles a second, perhaps. And then you have following it, you have these horizontal rips that happen because it's not just enough.
It's too much energy.
It's losing matter not only this way, but it's also losing matter progressively this way.
Yeah.
So the force is actually almost traveling like a wave. So it breaks this direction. And then as it's uncovered going this direction, you have micro fractures that go back the other way.
Right.
Which is why you see the one big fracture down the middle, and then you have these micro fractures
right.
that happen.
And just as a and when you think about, you're talking about the amount of energy that's being released.
Yeah.
I don't think we can comprehend that.
No.
At all. I don't know if there's anything man-made or even a volcano. You just think of a volcano, how violent it is, and this is exponentially more energy than a volcano.
Yeah, well, more energy than probably anything we know of on the Earth.
Yeah, we can even compare to.
And there's some interesting discussions that they get into about that, and some people have made some pushback on the theory because of that. But I think there's some good explanations for where all that energy went and why it didn't cook the entire planet.
Right.
That we can get into maybe on a later episode. But so you have the continents drifting away from one another, all the water being pushed out from under them. They're settling in to the mantle. They're beginning to slow. And what happens is actually because of the mass shift of the Earth, where the majority of the mass shifted, which is right around that kind of really where the Tibetan Plateau is, you have this caving in of the Pacific. And so you actually, if you look at the topography of the Pacific Ocean, you have what is basically, it's been cupped like if you took a ping pong ball and pressed it in.
So the Tibetan Plateau, if anybody's curious where the Tibetan Plateau is, it's over here.
And it may not just be the Tibetan Plateau. It may be the entirety of the European continent. Sits on the exact opposite side of the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah. You're talking about here, right?
Yeah.
This plateau here.
But the idea is that when this mass shifted, it had to pull mass from somewhere. And so it, just like if you were to be able to put negative pressure on a ping pong ball, eventually you would get to a point where it would have to relieve the pressure and one of the sides would cup in.
Right.
Effectively, that's what happened to the mantle. And then you have on top of that, these hydroplates that are all beginning to crash into one another and crash into the mantle. And that creates a lot of fracture zones, which creates a lot of heat, which creates volcanoes and these fracture rifts that cause earthquakes. And so, and it goes into a lot more detail than that, but it's more than I can really talk about here. But essentially that's why the Ring of Fire exists, is because those plates shifted and then came into resistance and and then the mantle crumpled beneath what was left of it and created all these fractures.
Well, that would be the crumple zone.
Yeah.
I mean, because we had briefly discussed this in the last one where you talk about where the tall mountains are, because that's where the continent had slowed down and then the rest of the continent was coming. So if you look at it that way, you had basically the other side of the Pacific Ocean, that plate, and they're kind of colliding together right there, and it's creating that crumple zone. Yeah,
and that's why we see the major large mountain ranges are always on the what we call the leading edge of the continent. So the western side of North America, South America, and mostly on the eastern side. Now there are some up in the Alps that are kind of tall.
Well, they would still be, the Alps would still be right there on that plate where the European.
And there was probably some movement down. Like I said, this theory has not been, it's been well defined, but it has not been well studied. Outside of the few people that have really taken to it. So that's one of the reasons I bring this up, is I'm hoping maybe somebody will down the road take up this mantle.
Maybe we can at some point, right?
So let's talk a little bit more. I want to get into one more thing about the geology. And so if you want to bring up the one from the fossil, the polystrate fossil. So one of the big consequences of the hydroplate theory is all this sediment and rock that was essentially ejected from the crust and put in different places, which we'll talk about also. But the idea is that all this water came out, all this sediment came out. So basically what you had was an earth that was sort of one big slurry of mud. And at the same time, water's still coming out. So you're still creating a lot. If you know anything, like I have a pool at home, and if you stir that pool up and then you keep the pump running, it'll continue to stir the pool up.
Yep.
But eventually over time, even with that pump running, it'll settle back out. And so what happened is the sediments began to settle out. And as they do, they go through what's called liquefaction, which is this progressive sorting of sediments by density and also by size. And it probably happened in stages. So in other words, you had some sediment that's settled out, filtered and settled out, and then higher sediments filtered and settled out. So you have this repeating pattern of rocks where you might have 7 layers, and then you have that same 7 layers on top of it, but they're all sorted basically, and they occur in very defined layers. They're not like mismatched. They tend to be fairly straight. There's actually some places where they jump up and change angles that sort of really cement the idea of the hydroplate theory in my mind.
Cement, that's a great word.
But the point being is that modern geology would say that these layers were laid down over millions and millions of years. But the layers are far too defined and straight. In other words, you would think over time you would see where, if they were being laid down, if it were possible to be laid down over millions of years, that you would have wearing in certain spots where you might have, it doing this, and then all of a sudden the layer dips down
because it's not as strong a rock or whatever.
Well, I should say the top of the layer dips down, so you have this kind of like oblong shape because erosion and water and wind but you don't see that. You see these pretty much flat layers, and they persist all over the world. They're on every continent.
And of course, you're talking about the uniformitarianism, which
uniformitarianism would say that would be the idea that things have always progressed, and that these were laid down over millions of years by the same process. But the other thing that's interesting about sedimentary rock is that it has a binder in it. In other words, if you know anything about concrete, you mix up a concrete with a binder, and then the water actually comes out of the concrete, and it's the binder that locks the material together. Sedimentary rock can only be formed through the use of water. You have to dissolve it in the water, and then actually it's I'm not sure if it's calcium carbonate or if it's another calcium or calcium bicarbonate, but one of them is what is limestone effectively is what binds these rocks together. So when you look at a sedimentary rock under a microscope, you're going to see little crystals of rock, and then these binders, the cement that holds them together, which that only happens in water.
Yeah, and as it cures. And that's how concrete's in it, like the Hoover Dam. It's still curing.
And this blows my mind why scientists don't assent to the idea of a global flood, because you have sediments that are known to only form under dissolution, well, not dissolution, but being in water.
Yeah.
All over the world. That would seem to me would indicate that at one point or another there was water all over the world.
Right.
Now, the reason they don't do that is because they think these layers have been laid down successively by successive floods over millions and millions of years. So perhaps the world flooded completely several thousand times, or at least 20 or 30 times
all over the millions of years.
So anyway, there's a lot of other stuff that I could talk about, but we're running out of time. So I did want to get to the polystrate fossils here, and just fossils in general. There's let's talk about fossils in general first. There's a phenomenon that happens in the sorting that we talked about, liquefaction, where you actually get something called lensing. And what that is it's actually where there's a difference in density enough between the material that's above and below that one of them floats a little higher than the other, and it actually creates this layer of sort of cleanish water in between it. And you can see this on experimentation. And what happens is things can get trapped between it. And so one of the things that they proposed within the theory is that how we got our coal and our oil deposits is basically all this mass of vegetation that's being ripped off of the earth during the flood is getting caught in these liquefaction layers, these lens layers in between the rocks. And they congregate, and they're actually able to slide if the whole thing gets tipped, like when a mountain's coming up, it can actually slide along that sort of highway,
that seam,
and all congregate in one area. And then when the when the rock falls down on top of it and settles and squeezes, it turns it into these different coal seams.
Right.
And stuff.
Yeah. Back into carbon.
But the most troubling thing for geologists is this thing that you see here, which is called a polystrate fossil. And that's a fossil that actually goes through multiple layers of rock that are supposedly varying in age by several million years.
It's a really old tree.
Yeah. And we talked about it briefly in the other episodes. There's whole forests that are like this. They've actually even found a whale that is a polystrate fossil.
Fascinating.
That actually breaches several different. They don't really deal with this stuff in the literature.
Yeah.
And for good reason.
They look past it. They look past
you
it.
don't hear much about this, even though there's well-known places that you can go and see these things.
Yep.
So that's a real problem. But when you think about it from a hydroplate theory, what would prevent a tree trunk from being stuck vertically in the mud, and then just over time it just sits down on top of it and goes through or for that matter, a whale.
He had a whale of a time over millions of years.
Yeah. So that's kind of the first part. We're going to kind of cut it here just so that we're not overloading you. And then we're going to do another episode and talk about 3 other things that are really interesting.
And as we mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of information with this that we kind of want to point out and explain it a little bit more. Yeah. So this is the part 1 of this conversation of truth that we're getting into, as far as kind of explaining the reasoning behind the hydroplate theory.
Yeah. So we do have a few more minutes. What do you think so far? Like, what are your thoughts on what we've talked about?
Yeah. And that's
because I haven't given you a lot of room to talk.
Oh, that's okay. It's, like I said, you showed me this theory. I've been learning more and more about this theory. I've had my own theories too about how the flood has happened. Of course, I briefly mentioned the canopy theory. I think just when we look at Genesis 7:11, I think there's a mixture of the two. I think there was a canopy, and that's where it talks about the waters from the heavens falling.
And that would explain some of the things about maybe filtering out UV light and longer lifespans.
Stuff like that.
Animals being able to grow to larger size because maybe there was higher air pressure. There's a lot of stuff that comes along with the canopy theory that I don't think it's an either or thing. I think it's maybe in both and.
Exactly. And then when you were talking about too, how the earth kind of breathed as the moon moves around it, and it was watering, it talks about how water came up from the ground.
Well, that's another great point, right? Because that movement could actually act as a pump to push water that's in the ground back to the surface.
And it watered. And that's kind of what we read in Genesis. So, the interesting thing, and of course, that's our perspective. Our perspectives from the Bible, which, I know you're going to have your naysayers, but what other piece of literature do we have that even gives us some vague idea of what it was like that many years ago? And I think it's also interesting. You can use that same pumping description, and you look at how our tides work, and it looks exactly the same to this day as the moon moves around.
The water moves in the same way that the crust would have worked.
So it's very similar.
It's actually kind of funny because I saw this was actually, I think, from something from Neil deGrasse Tyson, where he actually did it's not so much that the water moves, it's that the earth rotates into it. So the water's constantly bowed out at the same, and the earth just rotates. It rotates into the tide and out of the tide.
That's an interesting perspective.
So it's interesting. But
so we're gonna end this part 1 of our conversation of truth. We're gonna continue it on the other side. And if you don't want to continue our part 2, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our conversation of truth concerning one of our previous episodes in the hydroplate theory. Again, I'm Trevor. This is Nick. If you liked it, make sure you hit like and subscribe, and look at some of our other partners on Agape TV.
And as always,
as we end each of our show, keep seeking the truth, and the truth will set you free. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.